The smell reached them before the building did. Not the smell of coal smoke or wet wool or the iron scent of cold rail tracks that had followed them for weeks. Not the smell of crowded transport cars or old barracks or snow, beginning to melt into mud beneath boots worn almost through. This was different, softer, stranger. It floated through the morning air in slow waves and seemed almost impossible at first, as if memory itself had become confused. Bread, fresh bread, warm bread, the scent drifted across the frozen road and settled over the column of prisoners like something forgotten, returning from very far away. For a few moments, nobody spoke. The men simply walked, boots scraping over old snow pressed hard by wagon wheels and winter feet. Breath rose in pale clouds around them. The sky overhead had the colour of worn paper. Frost clung to fence posts and telephone wires stretched across the fields like dark lines drawn against the morning. A younger prisoner finally lifted his head. He blinked once, then again. "Do you smell that?" he asked quietly. No one answered, not because they had not heard him, because they had. Hope had become a dangerous instinct. Hope made cold nights longer. Hope made men stare too long at distant lights. Beside him walked an older man named Weber, whose grey beard held small crystals of frost. He kept his eyes fixed ahead. "Probably for somebody else," he muttered. No bitterness, just routine. The routine of disappointment. The younger man nodded and lowered his eyes. Still, after a moment, he breathed in again, carefully, as if trying not to scare the scent away. Bread, real bread. Ahead, the road curved beside a stand of leafless trees. Their branches looked black against the pale sky, reaching upward like fingers frozen in place. Beyond them, something slowly emerged through the morning haze. Red brick, wide windows clouded with steam, smoke rising from vents overhead, men carrying flour sacks through a side entrance, a bakery. Several prisoners stared openly now. One gave a quiet laugh beneath his breath, not because anything was funny, because disbelief and humour sometimes lived close together. "A bakery," someone whispered. "Imagine that." The guards said nothing. They simply kept walking. Yet the prisoners looked at one another uneasily. Suspicion moved among them as naturally as cold. War had taught them that kindness often arrived wearing another face. The town itself seemed impossibly ordinary. Wooden storefronts, a church steeple in the distance, snow gathered beneath windows. Somewhere, far away, a bell rang once. The sound disappeared into the cold air. They expected to continue through. They always continued through. But when they reached the bakery, the guards stopped. Silence followed. Men shifted their feet. Hands rubbed together inside thin gloves. Waiting had become another occupation entirely. One guard exchanged quiet words with another and disappeared inside. The prisoners stood still. Steam drifted from a vent overhead and vanished into the pale morning sky. The younger prisoner looked toward Weber. "Why are we stopping?" Weber shrugged slowly. "Maybe someone made a mistake." Nobody smiled, because it sounded possible. Then the door opened. Warm light spilled across the snow, and with it came the smell, stronger now, richer. Fresh loaves, yeast, cinnamon, coffee perhaps. The scent rolled through the air and struck something deep inside men who had spent years teaching themselves not to remember. One prisoner closed his eyes, another looked away immediately, because memory could hurt too. Sometimes more than hunger. Behind the doorway stood a broad-shouldered man in a flour-covered apron. White dust covered his hands and sleeves. He looked at the prisoners for several long moments. Then he glanced toward the American officer beside him. The officer gave a small nod. The baker looked back at the men. "Come inside," he said. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. No one moved. The younger prisoner stared openly. Weber frowned. Someone finally spoke. Inside? The baker nodded. Before you freeze out here. Still nobody moved. Suspicion again. That old companion. Men did not survive war by trusting strange generosity. Weber spoke under his breath. Nothing comes free. Nobody disagreed, because experience had made him sound wise. The baker watched them for another moment, then he looked toward the warm room behind him and said quietly, "Bread gets cold too." Something changed then, small enough to miss, but it changed. Not in the air, in the men. Something loosened, something human. And slowly, uncertainly, they followed him inside. Warmth struck them first. Not heat exactly, more like memory. It touched their faces and hands and eyes with such sudden gentleness that several men stopped walking altogether. Steam drifted near the ceiling. Light reflected against metal trays and wooden shelves lined with bread. Real bread, row after row of it. Golden crusts, flour dust, rising steam. The room carried a quiet hum of movement and ovens and distant voices. For a moment nobody spoke. Nobody knew how. The younger prisoner stared openly at the shelves. His eyes moved slowly, as though afraid the image might disappear if he looked too quickly. Weber removed his gloves one finger at a time, not because he needed to, because his hands seemed uncertain what else to do. Across the room, workers continued moving naturally around tables and ovens. One kneaded dough, another carried trays. Nobody stared. Nobody laughed. Nobody pointed. That felt stranger than anything else. A prisoner beside Weber whispered, "Why aren't they looking at us?" Weber did not answer immediately. Then he said softly, "I don't know." The baker returned carrying a tray. Fresh rolls rested across its surface. Steam rose upward in thin, white ribbons. He set the tray down near the men and looked at them. "Go ahead." Nobody moved. Again. The younger prisoner looked toward the guards, toward Weber, toward the baker. "How much?" he asked carefully. The baker frowned. "How much what?" "How much are we allowed?" The baker stared for a moment, then he looked at the tray, then back toward the prisoners. "Take as much as you want." Silence followed. Complete silence. The words landed but seemed unable to settle. "As much as you want." The younger prisoner blinked. Weber stared. Another prisoner gave a dry laugh beneath his breath. "Very funny." The baker did not laugh. "I said take some." Nobody moved. Hunger and suspicion stood facing one another like old enemies. The younger prisoner reached first, slowly, almost apologetically. His hand trembled. He picked up a roll, warm, soft. Too soft. He stared at it, turned it over in his hands. Steam rose against his face. Then very carefully he tore away a piece and placed it into his mouth. No one spoke. He chewed once, twice, then stopped moving entirely. Weber looked toward him. "Well?" The young man swallowed. His eyes had changed. "It's warm," he whispered. That was all, just warm, yet something inside the room shifted. Men stepped closer. Hands reached outward, quietly at first, then more. Someone laughed suddenly. Someone else closed his eyes while eating. One older prisoner sat down heavily in a chair and stared at his bread for several seconds before touching it. Tears rolled down his face without expression, as if his body had decided something before he did. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. A worker passed nearby, carrying fresh trays. He smiled at one prisoner and nodded. Such a small thing. Almost nothing. Yet the prisoner looked startled, like a man hearing a familiar song in a place where music should not exist. Weber finally took a roll. He turned it slowly in his hand, studied it, then took a bite. He chewed in silence. Outside, snow continued falling lightly beyond the windows. The world remained exactly where it had been. The war remained. The fences remained. Yet warmth filled the room. Warmth and bread and strange, quiet kindness. Weber looked toward the baker after a long while. "Why?" The baker wiped flour from his hands. "Because you're cold." Weber stared at him, waiting for more. None came, just that. "Because you're cold." Later, they stood outside again. The day had moved toward evening. Pale sunlight stretched low across the snow, and long shadows crossed the road. Smoke rose from chimneys. Wind moved through distant trees with a sound like quiet breathing. The prisoners formed their line again. The guards adjusted coats and prepared to continue walking. Yet something had changed. Not around them, inside them. The younger prisoner carried half a loaf wrapped carefully inside cloth. He held it with both hands, not tightly, carefully, like something fragile. Weber walked beside him. Neither spoke for some time. Their boots pressed fresh tracks into the snow. The bakery slowly disappeared behind them, red brick becoming shape, shape becoming shadow. Finally, the younger man looked back. "I still don't understand it." Weber nodded slowly. "Neither do I." Silence returned. The cold felt different now, not warmer, just different. The younger man stared ahead. "I thought Americans hated us." Weber took several steps before answering. "Maybe some do." More silence. The younger man glanced back once more. Smoke drifted above the bakery roof into the fading evening light. "Then why?" Weber looked toward the pale sky, toward distant trees, toward the road stretching ahead beneath winter clouds. For a long while he said nothing at all. Then finally he spoke, quietly, almost to himself. "Maybe hungry men look the same everywhere." The younger prisoner said nothing after that, because there are moments too small to seem important while they happen. A loaf of bread, a warm room, a stranger saying, "Take as much as you want." Small things. Yet sometimes history changes shape around small things. Sometimes walls become thinner for a moment. Sometimes fences stop being fences. Snow continued falling as evening arrived. White against grey sky, white against dark trees, white settling softly over roads and roofs and footprints left behind. Years later, many of the men would remember very little about transport routes or dates or weather. Memory is strange that way. It keeps what it chooses. And somehow, among all the noise of war and all its terrible machinery, among fences and fear and loss, one thing remained. The smell of warm bread rising through winter air. Strange what survives. Stranger still what saves us. Because men often imagine humanity arriving in grand gestures, in speeches, in victories and flags. Yet sometimes it enters quietly through a bakery door while snow falls outside. Sometimes kindness does not ask who deserves it. Sometimes it simply notices who is cold. And perhaps that is why memory held on to that morning so fiercely, not because it fed hunger, because for a few brief moments it fed something even war had failed to freeze.